I'm honored to begin this second session of the day, which I think would be a colorful, so to say, session, because both our speakers are, as you will see, do history in a very creative way, not just the archives, or not just the paper archives. Our first speaker is Professor Jacobo Sefami, who is a grandson of Sephardic Jews who immigrated to Mexico City from Turkey and Syria. And asking to tell about himself, this is the first thing that he said, so I think it shows something about the center of his identity. Professor Sefami is a professor of Latin American literature at the University of California, Irvine. He's also the director of the Spanish Summer School program at Middlebury College and editor of the academic journal Mexican Studies. He's also the author of several books and articles on Latin American poetry, but also of a novel, not only academia, but also the material academia reads. The novel Los Dolientes, recently translated and published in English as Mourning for Papa, a story of a Syrian Jewish family in Mexico. And his lecture today will be Latin American Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewish writers between the ancient and the modern worlds in search of identity. We will have a 25 minutes lecture and then 5 minutes discussion, and then the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Menashe. Thank you very much. Thank you to Margalit Bejarano and to Tom Tovasis, to all the organizers and the institutions involved in this conference. So I'll start with a personal note, and the personal note says, wrong, got off? Okay. Can I close? No. Not? Oh. Okay. Lot of. It's okay. No problem. So this is my personal notes. What are the effects of migration on identity? My paternal grandfather left Istanbul and went to Damascus and then he met my grandmother. He went with his brothers-in-law to Mexico City. No? Lot of?
I just read if you want.
Oh, thank you. He met his wife in Damascus, and then he had a couple of children, left with his brothers-in-law, went to Mexico. 10 years later, my grandmother arrived, and then they had more children, among them my father. My maternal grandfather is from Aleppo, and he married my grandmother in Mexico. She's also from Damascus. So the question is, and obviously I was born in Mexico with parents born both in Mexico. I emigrated to the U.S. about 25 years ago. So the question is, who am I? A Sephardic Jew, a Syrian Jew, a Shami, a Halevi, a Mexican-American, or Chicano? Am I a Chicano Shami? Am I culturally from the East or from the West? If I use Yehuda Levi's famous line, Livi במזרח ואנוכי בסוף מערב, who am I? Where is my heart? And where is my body? I now live not in Spain, בסוף מערב, would say Yehuda Levi, but in California. סוף מערב is all the way to California. How can I cultivate my Eastern spirit? When and how new identities are formed? When are we in the West will stop being recognized as Sephardi, Syrian, Ashkenazi, and will be known only as, let's say, Mexican Jew, as we love our kosher tacos and mariachis and trios, and now how to dance mambo or jarabe tapatio. Maybe we are all the clear illustration of the multi-identities born out of movement and displacement. I am all Jewish, Mexican, American, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Shami, Halevi, and yes, a writer and a scholar. What would my children be if my wife's family came to the U.S. from Russia, Romania, Azerbaijan? Are they the new brand of the Chicano Ashkefardics? This is just my personal note. Since the 1990s, several anthologies, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to talk about literature. I feel kind of not in place with some of the talks, but I will deal with literature now. Since the 1990s, several anthologies of Latin American Jewish writing have appeared. They reveal a trend, and I would say a boom, to this type of literature that has double, triple, and multiple cultural edges. Thanks in part to El Gran Libro de América Judía, the great book of Jewish Latin America, an enormous volume, more than 1,100 pages and 140 writers, edited by Isaac Goldenberg, I was able to identify many Sephardi, if you wish, Mizrahi Latin American writers. I have also benefited by other compilations, such as the one by Ostos Review. It's a review edited also by Isaac Goldenberg. A more recent issue has many more writers. So I was able to draw a list of Sephardi writers in Latin America, and I will just give you some of the names that I recognize as such. My list includes from Argentina, José Saxon, Humberto Constantini, Ricardo Halak, Liliana Mizrahi, Marcos Ricardo Barnatán, who emigrated later to Spain, Reina Rofe, Ana Maria Shua, Mercedes Rofe, or from Cuba, Rafael Eli, Ruth Bejar, from Chile, Esther Benari, from Mexico, Esther Cohen, Miriam Moscona, Angelina Muñiz, Rosa Nizan, Vicky Nisri, Jenny Ace, Yvonne Saed, Alberto Busali, Alejandro Terrar, Esther Charabati, and I would include myself in this list. From Guatemala, Victor Pereira, David Unger. From Uruguay, Teresa Porcekansky. From Venezuela, Isaac Chocron and Sonia Chocron. It's just to give you some of the names that are recognized as part of this body of literature. As it is common in preparing a list like this one, it is a provisional and arbitrary way to bring a group of writers together. I should perhaps need to add to this list of the memoirs written by Nisim Teubal in Argentina, Isaac Tabaj Askenazi in Mexico, Abraham Botbol Hachuel in Venezuela, and Elias Cerusi in Uruguay, and other documents of oral histories, and I think the talk that will follow will help us to that have been compiled in recent years in a number of Latin American countries, and I'm very interested in reading some of those stories. As I say, these writers pertain to many traditions, and in some cases they have Ashkenazi backgrounds as well. And in this sense, the list restricts them to a commonality that may be too far or too obscure for them. The most obvious example in this instance is Ricardo Halak, who has written very little about his background. Also, I'm excluding Ashkenazim or even non-Jews who have attempted to address the Sephardic identity. For example, in the first category, an interesting tradition in Argentina, work by Leo Senkman and others, Edna Eisenberg, who have written about this, and this is the Ashkenazi writers in Argentina very interested in Sephardic culture. And so you have such names as Marcos Aguinis, or a very well-known Juan Gelman, who wrote a book in Judeo-Español, Dibashu. Or you have writers Non-Jewish writers interested in Sephardic topics, such as the well-known Jorge Luis Borges, or in Mexico, José Emilio Pacheco with the novel Morirás Lejos, or various works by Homero Aridgis. One might argue that diversity is the primary element in constituting this list. The writing varies tremendously from author to author, not only from place to place, but also in the preoccupations, style, quality, etc. While some writers are well known in their respective countries, Muñiz is very well known in Mexico or Chocron in Venezuela, others might be considered marginal and at times represent emerging new discourses as should be seen in the novels by Reina Roffé. All of the writers should be situated with the paradigms or the geopolitical borders of their respective nations. That is, these writers really fit into the national paradigms where they were born. So a Mexican, Sephardic Mexican writer is really also a Mexican writer and corresponds to the literary trends from Mexico, and the same I could say for any of the other writers. In general, if we consider the topic of Sephardim, there are two, I would say there are two different approaches of these writers to this literature. One of them is the reflection and study of the splendor of the golden age of the Jewish medieval literature during the period of Arab domination of the Iberian Peninsula, and united to it the nostalgia and of a wonderful origin, and simultaneously the bitterness of the exile and the persecution across the centuries. The second element would be the representations of the modern or contemporary Sephardim with emphasis on migration, adaptation, assimilation, traditions, and customs, as well as cultural reaffirmation, conscience of being minority, disputes of identity, etc. Clearly, as in a great part of the Jewish literature, a feature that repeats itself constantly is the insistence in the migration and the interdependencies of the Latin American communities with those of Israel, the United States, and other countries. So I'm going to be talking about the second aspect, since I don't have time to discuss the first aspect. It's a commonplace affirming that the Sephardic splendor is a matter of the past. Perhaps it would be necessary to restate this question, thinking that in the 20th century, there have been Sephardi and Mizrahi writers of first ranking on a global scale, like the Nobel Prize of Literature Elias Canetti, the French poet of Egyptian origin Edmond Jabès, the French philosopher of Algerian origin Jacques Derrida, or the novelist of family from Greece Albert Cohen. So there is already an anthology of world contemporary Sephardi writers edited by Ilan Stavans, although I think more needs to be done. I'm not satisfied with that anthology. There are two other anthologies, one done in the United States called, yes? Called Tov? There are two other anthologies that I would indicate that Sephardic Voices done in the United States, an anthology of Sephardi Mizrahi literature here in Israel by Amiel Al-Khalai. Sephardim stick to a culture of splendor. Although the Sephardim stick to a culture of splendor, the Jews of these regions are perceived as ignorant and superstitious. In an article published by Daniel Schroeder called Orientalism and the Jews of the Mediterranean, he does a sharp analysis of the transition that goes from a position of high spiritual, educational, and religious lineage, normally affiliated to the high influence of the Sephardim of the Golden Age, to a supposed age of decline. Schroeder shows one of the key moments in this transition, the identification and invention of the Oriental to apply to the Jews of the north of Africa and the Middle East. The article supports his arguments with the reflections done in 1792 by Samuel Romanelli, an Italian Jew, in reference to the Jews of Morocco. Basically, Romanelli links the perception he has of the Muslims to that of the Jews, assuming that the latter ones have not had clear options of cultural and educational development. since, according to him, the context and oppression of Islamic society was keeping them marginalized from progress, science, and knowledge. And I here quote Romanelli, quoted by Daniel Schroeder, and he says, "The lack of books and news mires their hearts in the mud of ignorance and superstition. They tend to view all new and mysterious things previously unknown to them as miracles. The sciences are too lofty for them. Their ignorance is bliss, for they say that many victims have been thrown into the pits of heresy and atheism by science. The light of knowledge does not shine upon them, nor has it even reached them until now to eradicate their moral failings and their immature vanities. A veil of obscurantist faith corrupts their hearts and blinds their eyes." Until here the quotes. Romanelli follows the models from the European illustration to show North African and Middle Eastern countries as ignorant, irrational, and superstitious, thus unable and incapable to develop scientific knowledge. Schroeder says, and I quote, "Enlightenment uses Islam to legitimize the superiority of rationalist European civilization in an age of developing nationalism. This was the ideological basis to justify European imperialism in North Africa and the Middle East, since the time that Napoleon invades Egypt at the end of the 18th century. The irony in Romanelli's text is that up to that moment, Sephardim, defined as in the broader sense, to include all North African and Middle Eastern Jews, had been perceived, per Jews and non-Jews, as the nobility and cultural elite of the Jewish world. Some historians, for example, have argued that the Spanish decline and the changes of economic order that brought up such countries as Holland are a direct consequence of the Sephardic exile and their contributions in Northern Europe. The culmination of all that in economic terms would be Werner Sombard's theory, which attributes to Sephardim the entrance of capitalism to world order. Curiously, on having obtained civil rights as citizens after the French Revolution, Jews began to identify themselves with the nation-states in which they were living. As a result, the alliances of Jews that went beyond borders and linguistic barriers were diluting to the point that the emancipation produced a new dichotomy, north-south, west-east. Also, it is interesting to note that at the same time as scorn was developing from the German Jews towards Eastern Europeans, with the word Ostjude, the Oriental Jew to refer to Jews of Eastern Europe as the backwards ones that were maintaining customs of superstition and ignorance. Argentine writer Ana Maria Shua uses playful and sarcastic language regarding this concept of Orientalism, and I want to read a quote to illustrate her irony. She says, "We Jews are all aristocrats, like the Irish, and within this aristocracy, the farther to the west, the finer mensch. My Lebanese grandfather, for example, boasted of the lineage of his blood being from Beirut, that is, superior to those from Damascus and those from Vil Aleppo, those puny devourers of Kippeh Halabiyeh. And on my mother's side, my Lithuanian Jewish grandparents were considered naturally superior to the Arabs, but always with the criteria that the race improves as you move towards the west, all Jewish Slavs among them. There are the hierarchies which distinguish the Russians from the Polish, from the Bessarabians, from the Lithuanians, consider themselves inferior to the Yekes, the German Jews. With this criteria, the most refined nobility correspond to Italian, French, and English Jews." At this point, I remember a curious detail from Kafka's biography written by his friend Max Brod, which relates the emotional shock and the interest Kafka felt when he had the opportunity to meet those strange Oriental Jews with their typical dress, their antiquated customs, their peculiar dialect. Kafka and Brod, residents of the sophisticated city of Prague, called those from the shtetls, the Jewish settlements in Russia and Poland, the Oriental Jews. In general, from the splendor of Sephardic culture extended not only in North Africa and the Middle East, but also in different parts of Europe, it goes to a division between Western and Oriental, mainly dominated by the countries of origin and their respective economic cultural developments. The marginality stereotype and exotic perception of the so-called Third World goes hand in hand with the Jews who inhabited these regions. Although in Latin America the distinction between Mizrahim and Sephardim doesn't exist, there are tensions between the various communities that appear in some of the texts. Victor Pereira, a Guatemalan American, affirms that his great-grandfather signed his testament with the letters in Hebrew Samech and Tet, initials for Sephardi Taor, or true Sephardic, implying this distance from both with regards to the other Jews and with conversos. Something similar happens with the books of Mexican writer Rosa Nizan. In them, the contemporary Sephardi world appears through the story of a girl, and later a woman, of Turkish family in Mexico. Although from the beginning of the first novel, the tension is established in creating a new way of perceiving Mexicanness through the inclusion of the Jewish element, there are also clear allusions to the differences between the different groups of Jewish immigrants. Especially the distinction is noticed between the Syrian Jews and obviously the Sephardim, the Turkish. The mother of the protagonist says in reference to them, son atrasados y pesgados, a tu tía nunca la dejaron salir solas, traían maestro a la casa, ni amiga les dejaron tener. And this is in Judeo-Español. They are backwards and adread. They never allowed your aunt to go out alone. They would bring a teacher to the house. Oh, not even friends they let her have. The marriage between the aunt and a man of the Syrian community serves to illustrate the differences. The Syrians, according to the novel, are more religious and they stay faithful to their customs. The disputes run along the two novels with reproaches in both sides. The Halevi uncle says that, and I quote, in the knees where he goes, the prayer is finished later because it's more complete. He says he's stressing with his Judaism is superior to ours. He is superior to ours because according to him, we do not take the religion like it must be, and in Shabbat we drive our cars. He says that how is it possible that there is a microphone in our temple, which is to use electricity, and this is a sin, and that the Turkish rabbis are religious to his convenience. Until here ends the quote. It is possible that for a not informed reader, the variants of each of the Jewish communities in Mexico do not differ clearly. Having lived in the same city, they begin to intermarriage between the diverse community groups. The ending of Novia que te vea, or Like a Bride, is called the book in English, is precisely the marriage of the protagonist with Lalo, a man of Turkish father and Syrian mother. But curiously, instead of solving the conflict, the differences accelerated, and possibly they originate not only the divorce, the later divorce between them, but the separation of the protagonist to the Jewish community and her integration and assimilation into the non-Jewish society. The differences between Sephardim and Syrian Jews had to be reformulated in the adaptation of the novel to the film in a movie produced and directed by Gita Shifter, with a screenplay by Shifter herself, Rosa Nizan, and Hugo Iriart, and written by Iriart. The dramatic tension is created now through the dialogue of two friends, a Sephardi and an Ashkenazi. Two scenes clearly allude to the differences between the two communities. In one of them, before the request of the protagonist of studying painting, the Sephardi mother and her friends complain that the Ashkenazi friend is the one that puts ideas in her head. The Ashkenazim are those who transgress tradition, and I quote, the Yiddishikas are all atabanadas, disorder, one of the women says. Atabanadas, yes. The mother of Rilke, on the other hand, points out in the immediate following scene that the Sepharditas are backward schleppers, they are ignorant. Although the father defends them, continuing the phrase in an ironic way, ignorant such as, yes, Maimonides and Baruch Spinoza. To which the mother reacts, well, that was a long time ago. A common aspect, thank you. Okay. But Nizan is not the only woman to debate the attitude toward the patriarchal Sephardic culture. Liliana Mizrahi has expressed her dilemma in the following terms. And she says, and this is a writer from Argentina, to be a Jewish and a Sephardic writer is a complex experience. My need to be a transgressive woman is stalked every day, every morning when the young men pray. Thank you, God, for not making me a woman. the Sephardic, the ancestral that inhabits me, is also part of my Judaism, which obliges me to perpetuate myself in a static model. I struggle to save myself as a Jewish woman from the Jewish woman who torments me, the crystallized Jewish woman, the one who says, I am the echo of an echo of an echo. This internal struggle between the ancestral Jew and the transgressor makes explicit not only the struggle between two modes of relating with the Jewish tradition, but also between two aspects of Judaism. I would like to examine now how this internal battle of Sephardi, of Mizrahi, finds expression in the foundational novel of the contemporary Sephardi, Rompas en caso de incendio, Break in case of fire, 1975, by Venezuelan Isaac Chocron. In this novel, Daniel Bernabel, the protagonist, decides to travel to Spain and to Morocco after having lost his father, wife, and son because of an earthquake in Venezuela. The novel consists of the letters that Bernabel writes where he's exploring his identity and origin. So this is a movement from west to east again, going back to his roots. I'm going to try to make it short because I'm running out of time. But basically, during this trip, the protagonist becomes more and more adapted or assimilated to the place of origin, in particular in Tangiers. What I say is that basically through the novel, you can see that going out of the community that he belongs in Venezuela helps him become more critical of that community. The dichotomy East-West is raised as in Liliana Mizrahi between the ancient and the modern worlds. There is more ambiguity in the novel of Chocron, since the protagonist is modifying his remarks as time passes and he's integrated and disintegrated with the visited places. The contrast is also portrayed in economic terms. For example, Caracas works in the novel as the emblem of Western materialism in the context of the southern wealth derived from the development of the wells of oil, whereas Tangier turns out to be immersed in poverty and superstition. Whereas at his arrival to Tangier, Bernabel feels like that he can pass as a Moor and be in the city without major problems. Towards the end of the novel, he realizes that his assimilation was only a trick. Even if I remain here for 1,000 years, I will still be a foreigner, he says. Ironically, before taking the trip back to Venezuela, Bernabel dies stoned by Arab delinquents. The novel closes this way the circle with the one that opens. The trip stops without the possibility of knowing what will happen to Bernabel once he returns to Caracas. Nevertheless, the novel wants to be a celebration of cultural hybridity. Perhaps the most exciting part of the novel is the discovery and residence of the protagonist in Tangier. There, Bernabel sees himself as a chameleon that sits down happily to be able to pass in any of the three groups that inhabit the city, Muslims, Jews, and Christians. I am the conjugation of the three races, and I go from one to another, accepted in the three, although I confess that using babuchas instead of shoes is frowned by the Europeans and Hebrews. And I like to finish that saying that I believe that all of these writers represent a similar dilemma. Having raised in a modern Western culture, they confront their Eastern past, the traditions that prevent them to become independent thinkers. Yet, at the same time, they also reaffirm their identity in terms of language, food, music, habits, as they portray their multiple experiences. Thank you.